this is what I tell people, because remember there was this whole uproar about mail-in ballots and, how evil it was for Republicans to be criticizing mail-in ballots. But like, if there's 550,000 thrown out, there's only two reasons that they're thrown out. Okay. Here's the first reason. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. The first reason would be that the election official did the right thing and threw out a wrongful ballot. Okay, that's the first possible reason, which implies fraud, attempted fraud that the election official caught. The second reason is that the election official made a mistake and threw out a valid vote because the person screwed up their signature or whatever they did. But it was a real person, a real citizen trying to vote, and their ballot got thrown out. Neither of these situations are good. These are both bad situations. I can't imagine why we'd want this possibility in our voting system. So, I mean, I don't want to tell people you can't ever do mail-in voting. I mean, in Texas, we reserve it for the disabled and for the elderly who legitimately have problems showing up to the polls. That seems fair to me, but what are your thoughts on that?
Oh no, I agree. Look, we do need absentee ballots for people who are, too disabled or sick to make it to the polls, or frankly for overseas military personnel who can't be in town to vote on election day. But it really should be limited to that, and we should not encourage other folks who are able to make it to the polls to vote in person because, as you say, the rejection rate for absentee ballots is higher than for ballots cast in person. And it's for the many reasons, everything you've cited, everything from signatures not matching to voters making basic errors like forgetting to sign a ballot or not providing the information you have to provide with it. So all those people out there encouraging people to vote by mail, they're encouraging a higher disenfranchisement rate if they have the ability to vote in person.
What about early voting? There's some, at first glance, you're like, yeah, early voting seems good. Allows you to just get your vote in. But it does. The counter argument to that is that, there's sort of a national, I guess, what would I say? I don't know, a national, consensus around this idea that voting day actually matters because otherwise. Because again, it's a slippery slope argument. Why not vote all year, right? And kind of the point is that candidates have a certain amount of time to make their case to voters, and then as a nation, we all go and we vote on the same day. And so, what's the right limit for early voting, in your opinion?
I don't think it should be start 2 months before the election. I mean, think about that. During a presidential election, it means people are voting before the first debate has even started. And look, here's the big problem with early voting. And we saw it this year with the Super Tuesday primary, where if you recall, more than a dozen states held their primaries on Super Tuesday, beginning of March. This was before COVID-19 basically, shut the country down. Well, look, many of those states have early voting. Well, what happened 2 days and 1 day before Super Tuesday? Well, two of the major candidates running in the Democratic presidential nomination process dropped out, Senator Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg. But if you look at the vote totals in the states that have extensive early voting, you will find that hundreds of thousands of ballots were cast for two candidates who weren't in the election on election day. That means that all of those voters wasted their votes.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And that's the problem with early voting.
Yeah, that's a great point. And all of those people were like, I would have voted, for somebody else if I'd known this was going to happen. And this should be bipartisan. I mean, these are legitimate counter arguments. I mean, it's hard for me to understand the Democrat stance on this sometimes because they immediately say, no, you're just trying to disenfranchise people. I mean, this is always the argument. Right. And it's a very tiresome argument, frankly. And Republicans need to do a better job, which is why we're doing this podcast right now. We need to do a better job talking about how worthwhile it is to have a better, more airtight system that does the opposite of this. It actually enfranchises people and makes sure that their vote counts. I mean, So what? I mean, when somebody says that, oh, you're just trying to disenfranchise people. What is usually your argument? What is your response to that?
My response to that is trying to be sure that we have a fair and secure election process in which every legitimate voter can vote and their vote isn't negated by either fraud or mistakes made by election officials. That's not disenfranchisement. That's trying to enfranchise as many voters as possible.
When's the last time? So let's steelman their argument a little bit. When's the last time there was legitimate voter suppression?
I don't think there's been any of that for a very long time. The Voting Rights Act, was one of the most effective pieces of legislation to ever pass by Congress, and by the 1970s, all of the deliberate attempts to try to keep people from being able to vote, particularly minority voters, had virtually disappeared. All the most recent claims made about vote suppression are just a myth, and they're used as a way to try to stop reforms intended to clean up the election process. I mean, the idea that voter ID is vote suppression is ridiculous because, look, every state that's put in a voter ID requirement has also put in a provision saying, look, if you don't already have an ID, the state will give you one for free.
Yeah.
So we know it doesn't keep people out of the polls.
Yeah, and I would also say if you really believed that people could not get an ID, and that's why they shouldn't need an ID to vote, then that would represent a problem. And the problem would be we need to get people IDs because you need IDs in life. That would seem to be the obvious solution there. But yet they still say, and so this is why conservatives get pretty paranoid about the left's intentions on this, because from our point of view, we're thinking, okay, so you're making up these arguments about voter suppression, and it's for the reasons you stated, right? To fight against any reforms that we have to tighten up the process. And then we have to think, okay, well, honestly, what are your intentions here? What is the intention behind creating such a loose framework for voting? And it leads us to believe that the only possible explanation is that you want to cheat. You want to cheat. I mean, and that leads us to the situation we're in. And it's hard. If I try my best to assume the best of intentions from what they're saying, it's hard, right? It's hard to come up with alternate explanations besides, do you just want to cheat? So, I mean, but since you do this every day, and I assume you hear these counter arguments, are there any honest brokers on the other side that really believe what they're saying for honest reasons?
I maybe I've turned into too much of a cynic, but it's hard for me to see any rational reasons for opposing things like voter ID. Or look, in recent years, the left has even filed lawsuits to prevent states who wanted to compare their voter registration lists with other states.
Yeah.
So why in the world would you oppose something like that? I mean, that just makes no sense whatsoever, unless you want the possibility that people could vote in two different places because you think it might help you win an election. Right.
Or they're just completely and utterly convinced that all we want to do is throw out, Democrat voters registration, I guess. I mean, again, I'm just trying to, but they'd have to believe that we really want to do that. And it's just not true. It's never been true. And there's no evidence for it. So it's just a strange thing.